Okay, so then Islam emerges by the traditional dates. The Prophet Muhammad is born in Mecca in AD 570. He begins preaching in 610, dies in 632. The conquests begin almost immediately, really towards the end of his life. There are some battles at the edge of the Byzantine Empire, and within 100 years, Islam conquers, as you know, and you've written about it in The Shadow of the Sword. It conquers an empire that is to the Indus River in the east and to the south of France in the west. I think Poitiers, the Battle of Poitiers, is 732, so nicely 100 years after Muhammad's death. Was the success of Islam as an empire because of the failure of the Byzantine Rome and its marriage of Roman power and Christianity?
I think that that what becomes Islam is a result of two things, to simplify massively. The first is an absolute cascade effect of calamities that overwhelms both the Roman and the Persian worlds, of which plague, I think it is, I mean, even since I wrote it, I think the evidence for the plague having been the Justinianic plague, the plague that breaks out in the mid-6th century, having had a devastating impact, has grown and grown. And that plague would disproportionately have affected settled and urban areas. So freakishly, perhaps for the first time since the emergence of civilization in Mesopotamia, the balance of population, and therefore the balance of power between the Fertile Crescent and the regions bordering the Fertile Crescent are kind of less pronounced than they might otherwise have been.
Yes, yes.
And then on top of that, you have this terrible war in the first decades of the 7th century between Rome and Persia, between Constantinople and Persia, and it leaves the traditional centers of civilization, so from the Mediterranean through to Iran, absolutely devastated. It's kind of like the aftermath of the Second World War. And throughout this period, both the Persians and the Romans have been employing Arab troops as mercenaries along their borders. And you'll read in history books after the Romans defeat the Persians, they reoccupy, they take back Palestine and Syria. But what does that mean? I mean, who are the Romans? What are we talking about when we talk about the Romans? I mean, lots of them are Arab soldiers, and Arab soldiers can fight. There are different factions. So I think that in many ways, the conquest of Palestine and Syria and Iraq is kind of collateral damage, perhaps, in faction fighting between different bodies of Arabs, all of whom have different relationships to their Roman and Persian paymasters.
Yes,
some are thinking,
of course,
we will profit from our imperial masters. Others, we will feed on them. But the other factor, of course, is the sectarian milieu, as it's called, the fact that you have Jewish and Christians, you have heretics who are Jewish and Christian adjacent. You also have Zoroastrianism, of course, in the Persian world, and this provides sanction for conquest and for people who want to see themselves as the chosen ones of God. And when in due course, the richest provinces of the Roman and Persian empires kind of fall into the lap of various Arab war bands, how are you going to explain it? I mean, something as extraordinary as this can only be explicable in terms of God giving it to you.
Divine sanction. Yes.
Divine sanction, because there's no other way of explaining it. And I think that these are the circumstances that enable this extraordinary process of conquest to happen, and for the ideology to emerge, justifying it and explaining it, that over the course of the century and a half that follows will become Islam as we recognize it now. That's my feeling. That's my take.
It really is fascinating to read the classical sources speaking about the conquests, which, as you probably know, are called the Futuhat, classically, the opening of the world for Islam in Arabic. And concern in contemporary writings to interpret them as, well, not really wars of conquest, and there are different reasons why they took place, but ultimately it was for the good of different societies, or they were defensive in some way. But this is just not the vibe of the medieval Islamic chronicles. I mean, God was with us. God blessed the earliest Muslims because they were faithful to him.
But every enduring empire has to persuade those who've been conquered in the long run that it's for their own good. The Romans had done this. This is why when I talk about the Romans, I'm actually talking about people who live in Greece and Anatolia and Byzantium, who are calling themselves Romai in Greek, because they've come so utterly to identify with the name of their original conquerors that they are now Roman after Rome itself has fallen. And likewise, over the course of the Arab Empire, as it shades into the Islamic Caliphate, the genius is to persuade the conquered that it's been for their own profit. And of course, it's not one way, because what ultimately happens is that Islam, as we would recognize it now, is largely a creation of the conquered. It's people's turning the words of the Quran back on their conquerors and fashioning a much more inclusive civilization than the purely kind of ethnocentric empire that the original Arab conquerors had formed.
I think there's something to be said for that. One could shine light on the development of, let's say, the metropolitan context of Baghdad and the massive translation movement of works principally from Greek, also from Syriac, in the participation of Jews and Christians who were subjects of the Islamic Caliphate in that. But something else I think is also worth noting is that, I mean, Islam appears and doesn't disappear, doesn't retreat. I mean, the Umayyad Caliphate falls away, and eventually the Abbasid Caliphate loses its power, and the Mongols come in and things. But even when the Mongols come in and conquer Baghdad in 1258, they become Muslims. So there is a certain I don't know, enduring power of Islam on a social level.
Well, I think Islam is the most successful imperial ideology of all time. The Romans are long gone.